about money, right? Not to talk about money, not to talk about how to build wealth, not to talk about what their salary is or how to defer taxes. And in fact, in a lot of families, it was frowned upon. And I did not even realize this was abnormal until one day. I remember we were having a family dinner, and this was much later on. I was around maybe 25 or 26. And my brother was dating a girl pretty seriously for about 4 or 5 years. And we both had our partners and my parents, and we're having this nice family dinner. And like usual, the conversation turned to a little bit of politics, but mostly into finance, what we were going to do with some apartment buildings we were looking at, what we were talking about, some REITs that we were interested in investing in or pulling money out of, stuff like that. And it went on for like the whole dinner. We're drinking wine, having a lovely dinner, etc. And after that dinner, the kids, the kids being me and my brother and my girlfriend at the time and my brother's girlfriend, went out to hang out and do what young 20-year-olds do. And his girlfriend took me aside and took my brother aside and said, "You guys have the weirdest family I've ever been in." And that was the most bizarre family dinner I've ever been in. I'm like, "Why?" She's like, "All you guys talked about for that entire dinner was how to make money." She's like, "It's a Friday night. No one asked each other how their feelings were. No one asked each other what they're doing on the weekend. No one asked each other even about our relationships around the table. You talked about how to build wealth and how to make money." And I realized at that moment that we had a weird upbringing. But the reason that we're sitting here tonight is because you get to take advantage of that unique upbringing I had, where it was okay to talk about money and it was okay to talk about wealth building, and specifically about building wealth within the real estate space, right? And that's exactly what we're here to talk about tonight, which is investing in real estate, utilizing the CMHC MLI Select Program, not to create a nest egg, not to save a little for later or to find a way to, maybe get your kids a condo in downtown if they go to U of T, but to build actual wealth. So here's a little information on me. I don't think it's overly important. If you guys are curious, you can join that group and you can ask me anything about me. I'm an open book in the future. But here's a little bit of the stats on what we've done in the last year. We've generated over 200 million. This is actually outdated now. Over 250 million and nearly 600 homes sold, of which about 100 are affordable, which has generated well over $2 million of positive cash flow assets for those investors. And I'm so happy about that. So let me say something, right? This quote, I always love to bring this quote up. And I'm just going to read it out loud. 90% of all the millionaires became so through owning real estate. More money has been made in real estate than in all other industrial investments combined. The wise young man or wage earner of today invests his money in real estate. Now, who said that? Obviously, it's a little bit outdated by saying the wise young man, not, the wise young person. But it was Andrew Carnegie, billionaire, U.S. Steel. I mean, I think Carnegie Steel, mixing them up. But he owns, his name is on about half of downtown New York City. So he's a pretty well-known guy, right? And I think what he's saying is probably pretty true. I mean, we all have a friend who's a millionaire or a billionaire through real estate. The question is, and I can't do it when we're doing this online, but every time I ask this in a room, I say, who here has actually made millions in real estate? And some people do put up their hand, but a lot of people don't. But then I ask how many people have invested in real estate other than their primary residence. And a lot more people in the room put up their hands. So if you aren't becoming a millionaire through investing in real estate, what are you doing wrong? Where's the disconnect? Where's the missing link? Because we all know, I mean, if you have a guy who's a billionaire owning one of the largest industrial companies that made a significant portion at the time of the entire US economy, telling you real estate's the place to be, then how come your investment hasn't made you a millionaire yet? And I would argue, right or wrong, I would argue that the reason is because you have been taught to invest at the retail level, not at the wholesale level. You haven't been given the education on the system that is in place on the commercial side of real estate that allows real wealth building. And maybe I got that education because of my weird childhood, and most people didn't get to ask about how much money someone made or what the bond rates were that day. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about that CMHC MLI Select Program. So let's start at the very beginning. What is the CMHC? I'm sure 90% of the people in this webinar know exactly what CMHC is, but just to explain, because people often have the wrong idea of what their mandate is. CMHC is the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Company, right? They've been around going back to the 1960s. It's a federal program, basically an independent corporation run by the federal government. And their main objective, if you want to distill it down into a single sentence, is to provide financing solutions, including mortgage insurance for buyers, right? To help Canadians get homes. At the end of the day, their goal is to get homes in the hands of Canadians. They've been in the news a lot lately. Back in September was the biggest announcement they've made in quite a while when they brought up this new insured lending cap from $1 million to $1.5 million and expanding the amortizations from 25 to 30 years. And, you know, as you can see from this little excerpt here, it's the biggest, boldest reform in decades. And it kind of is because, you know, back when they originally said $1 million, the average house in Toronto was like $300K. And then they never raised it, even though houses went to $1 million, to $2 million, to $3 million, et cetera. And even more recently in the news, they announced that for 4-unit multiplexes, little apartment buildings or town blocks or, you know, units of the garden suite, they would offer up to $2 million insured lending, which was a huge change because this didn't exist at all before. And as Daniel Folk says, this is huge, right? But what most people don't realize is the two examples I just showed you, those two news stories, are residential personal lending. Most people are completely unaware. The average Canadian has no idea that CMHC also has a commercial insurance lending department, which is totally separate and operates totally different than the personal side, right? So everyone else knows CMHC because you're trying to buy your first house or your first condo, you're a little short on the deposit, and they let you go to 90% loan to value. But on the commercial side, it's a whole different ballgame. They basically just have a federal mandate to help get more rental stock built, right? And what they kind of realized is that the government is very bad at building and maintaining rental buildings. The government, you know, you've probably seen them around in the past, Regent Park or like some of those Toronto community housing setups. They're not great. The buildings are run down, they're poorly managed, and it's just not a good experience. So they very quickly realized that it was better to put the work into the private sector. But also that, you know, if you're a private enterprise guy like myself or many people in this room, taking on the risk of buying or building an apartment building is a big, big risk to take. They better offer something good in return, right? So the program we're talking about today is one of their commercial lending programs. It's kind of the cream of the crop, the top one. It's called MLI Select. And essentially this applies to any building that is 5 or more units. So that is kind of the definition of a multifamily dwelling. If it has 5 or more units, we call it a multiplex, multifamily, that sort of thing, right? Whether it's 5 units, 10 units, 100 units, it's all treated the same. Now, what they offer is very favorable, very aggressive financing terms that make it almost impossible to say no to either building a brand new building or to taking an existing building and renovating and improving it. Right. But obviously, they also want their pound of flesh. They are the government. They want to know that you're doing some sort of social good. So in return for giving you this amazing lending, they ask you to take care of some items, being affordability, accessibility, and energy efficiency. So we're going to go through and kind of explain what these are and how they work. So how do you actually qualify a building for this program? So we're going to learn about it. But the reason I like my cutesy little jokes here just for fun, because after we get further in this presentation, what you're going to come to realize is you don't need to know any of this knowledge because of how we help you. None of this is actually important for you to know. So this chart is a bit of a mouthful or eyeful to look at. You could say a doozy, but we're just going to briefly review it, right? And if you really want to dig into detail, this is freely available on the CMHC website. If you just type into Google CMHC MLI Select, the very first link will be the page right on CMHC's site. And this chart and several others are right there for you to study in detail. But the real key is going back to those 3 components. We have the affordability, the energy efficiency, and the accessibility. And you'll notice there's points here, and then there's the requirements below, right? So for example, if you put in 10% affordable, you get 50 points. If you put in 25% affordable, you get 100 points. Same thing with energy efficiency or accessibility. Now, what do these points do for you, okay? This is the chart that really is important. We, in general, only target the 100 points because you get the best incentives. Now, the first thing is that they will give you up to 95% financing against the cost of delivering your building. Think about that for a minute, okay? What is the cost of delivering a building? Obviously, the land is a big part of that, You have any planning costs. You have to pay architects, you have to pay designers, engineers, consultants along the way. You have the actual cost of applying to the city. You know, submitting a zoning application or submitting a planning application could cost tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Then you have any fees that are due to get your approvals, your building permits, any demolition of existing stuff like that, whatever's involved. And then, of course, the final step of actually building the building. They will lend you up to 95% of all of that cost. So think about that again for a minute. A $10 million apartment building, you only need $500,000. A $5 million apartment building, you only need $250,000. A $2 million apartment building, you only need $100,000. Okay. Beyond that, they will allow you to amortize that mortgage for 50 years, not 50 years, 50 years. Because if you're going to be taking out such a large loan and you want your building to be cash flow positive, I mean, no one wants to build an apartment building and lose money every month, then you really need to spread those payments out over quite a wide period of time to ensure that you can be cash flow positive, right? So they allow a 50-year loan. Because this is commercial lending, you get limited personal exposure to this loan. So unlike if you buy a condo right now for an investment, you have 100% exposure to that loan. In this case, you have limited exposure. And there's some other cool perks as well that we'll get into a little further in the presentation. But I just want you to realize that this really opens up possibilities. I mean, where else can you buy a property with only 5% in the door? I mean, I'm not saying this is fact checked, but I don't think there's anywhere on earth, really. I mean, even in the United States, they have a similar sort of program, but it's limited to 90-10. Here you're getting 95%. It's crazy what you can potentially purchase with such a small investment, right? So what are those components that we talked about? The affordability and the energy efficiency and the accessibility. The affordable is the one we really have to discuss. And we're going to spend a minute on it because a lot of people get scared by this word affordable. In fact, I also hear a lot of people use the word low-income housing, and I'm very, very quick to correct them. So if you were thinking low-income housing in your mind, I want you to completely erase that, because low-income housing, there are programs like that in Canada. This has nothing to do with that. Low-income housing is some sort of program where the government is paying you to have a tenant in there that has problems, whatever they may be, okay? Affordable is completely different. All that affordable is that CMHC, being a federal corporation with access to more data than any of us, is that they go around every major neighborhood and every major city, they apply a formula, and they come up with a number. Now, if you read quickly on the previous pages, that formula is 30% of the median income in that neighborhood. Okay, so if it was if the average person made 100,000, then 30,000 would be the maximum rent you could charge per year, which is about $2,550. Now, they play around with those numbers a little bit if they seem too high or seem too low, but regardless, they come up with this number for every area. Okay, all that it means is that you have to rent a component of your building at or below that number. It does not mean you have to take in an undesirable tenant. It does not mean you have to take in specific tenants the government forces you to, nothing like that, right? So it doesn't mean you're building a slum. It doesn't mean you're building a building that's going to have a lot of issues or problems. And also, because we're building a new building, we can get creative. We can engineer the building to make it not really a loss at all, right? So number one, we can build smaller units to designate as affordable, or we can put them in the basement, or we can use more basic finishes, other things like that. Number two, the affordability only speaks to the actual dwelling itself. Other items in the building that may be priced differently, you can charge for. So when I say auxiliary fees, maybe your building has free parking, but the affordable units pay $200 a month. Maybe your building includes a free locker for the market rent units, and you charge $50 a month for the affordable, right? Maybe that you're affordable, you create a special unit, your one bedrooms are normally 550 square feet, your affordable one bedroom is 400 square feet, so your actual cost per square foot rent is still the same. My purpose behind really dwelling on this point is, the reason I'm dwelling on this point is because this becomes, in all the meetings and all the discussions I've ever had, the sticking point, the confusion point, the concern. It is nothing to worry about. These are not low-income units. These are simply units that we get creative on, and we generally have no loss or a very small loss. And even if there is that very small loss from those affordable components, it is far outweighed by the unbelievable financing, which I've only explained half of so far. Now, in terms of the energy efficiency and the accessibility components, I'm going to tell you that I honestly don't know all of the details of both of those sections because I am not a code consultant. I am not an engineer. I am not a heat loss specialist, right? And I am certainly not an accessibility consultant or engineer either. If a building that we are working on for you in the future requires to have energy efficiency or to have accessibility requirements, it's as simple as us telling the planner, the architect, the engineer, we need to hit tier 2. And they will ensure the building meets those requirements. It does not matter if you know the details of that. I mean, they're changing those building codes all the time. If you want to study up on it and read on it, it's probably a 50-page document you can read through. But it's not essential that you understand the details of these components because number one, we primarily draw from the affordable category. And number two, in the same way you wouldn't ask your architect why the floor is 8 inches instead of 10 inches thick, you just accept from the consultants that if you want to hit those targets, you need those elements. The most important element of this entire thing is understanding that the affordable component is not a hindrance and it is not a problem that makes these buildings unattractive economically. In fact, quite the opposite, which you'll see as we continue through. So what is the full real benefits of the MLI program? Okay, so we already spoke about the fact that you get these 50-year loans and that you get up to 95% cost, meaning only 5% down. The other elements we did not discuss is the below prime rates and the 10-year terms that you can secure. This I can confidently say, there is nowhere on the planet that you can get cheaper money than CMHC MLI Select. Right now, this lending is between 3.5 and 3.8% for fixed rate mortgages, okay? What is a current regular mortgage if you're looking at, a bank, probably in the mid fours, insured lending is around 4 flat. Here you're locking in as low as 3.5. And the Canadian bonds have been dropping in the last couple of days. These could soon be into the low 3s or high 2s even. And what's amazing about that is you can lock in that rate for 10 years if you want. So let's think about the last 5 or 6 years. In 2020, people were getting these mortgages at 1.9% and securing 10-year terms on them. 2020, that means you have until 2030. What's happened between 2020 and now? Well, rates went up to 7%, and now they've started to come back down. People who owned investment properties, especially those on variable, were dying over the last couple of years, right? The guys who bought any building going back to 2016 or beyond with 10-year money, they didn't even care. If you were buying a building like this in 2020 at 1.9% interest, you're not even halfway through your term yet. Rates went up to 7. Now they're back to 3.5, and we're going, oh my God, it's so good. You still have 5.5 years left on your mortgage at 1.9%. This 10-year term is the secret sauce of stability that makes this so de-risked because you're never worried what happens if rates change now, change then. 10 years from now, this building will likely be so far up in value, rents will be so much higher than they are today that you're laughing at that point. So this program is really, really strongly engineered to make it almost impossible to say no to building an apartment building. And that's why it's so heavily used right now as well. So what does all that equate to at the end of the day? It basically equates to guaranteed high returns and almost guaranteed positive cash flow. And when you say, how can that be guaranteed? Because guarantee is a very, very strong word to use, right? I mean, it's not a word that should be used lightly in any sort of investments. It's not a word that should be used lightly in any sort of legal setting, real estate setting, unless there's real data behind it. Well, the fact of the matter is that it's not a trust me. I mean, some of you were, called and invited to this meeting. You have no idea who I am, or probably don't know that much about the person that reached out to you. So
can everyone hear?
No, it's
No, we can't.
Oh, I think we lost. One
Yeah.
second.
Frozen on my end.
I think Jake lost connection.
Just 1 second. Let me get it. Just hang on tight. Jake's having a little bit of internet problems. Just 1 second, guys. Just hang tight. Two more minutes, guys. Yeah, looks like we're getting back up. Nice. Jake, can you hear me? Jake, we can't hear you if you're speaking.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize I was still muted. I was apologizing, guys. I'm actually in Edmonton right now scouting new opportunities for CMHC, and the internet in the hotel just went out in the middle of that presentation. So I had to switch over to my hotspot. So I apologize for that. I'm not sure how much you may have missed there at the end while I was switching over. But what I was saying is that essentially when we submit any of these packages to CMHC, they have to audit and underwrite this entire file. They're looking at all of the financials. They're comparing it to the data they have, being a federal corporation, looking at, you know, what the rents are in the area, what the property taxes are, all of those elements, what it actually costs to build. Can you build it on budget? They're even looking into who the builder is, who the property manager is, and they want to see all these pieces painting a picture that makes sense for them. And they will only lend if they see that that project is projected to make more than 110% debt coverage, meaning that if the loan is $100, they want to see that the net operating income of that building is at least $110. So they remove a lot of risk from the equation because, again, I might be repeating myself. You know, I don't know exactly where the internet dropped here in this hotel, but it's not trusting me. It's not trusting the builder. You're trusting a group of experts, including a third party who has no financial vested interest in the project. Because if we submitted something to CMHC that doesn't make sense, they're going to tell us, get out of here, right? And the honest fact is that CMHC MLI rejects the majority of the proposals they get, not because it's hard to get approved, but because there's a lot of bad actors out there or people that don't know what they're doing, kind of throwing anything at the wall and hoping it sticks, right? In fact, it was getting so bad for a while that in September they had to tighten the application rules because they were getting so clogged up with bad proposals, right? But to me, I don't really understand the point of doing that, like hoping and dreaming you're going to have an approval, because it takes a lot of work to put this stuff together. So I want to make sure that, you know, our stuff makes sense. But essentially, you have so many people in this chain verifying, auditing, and reviewing these numbers, and there's such a healthy buffer of safety margin in all of these deals that things would have to get catastrophic before you essentially could not be cash flowing on these types of projects. So the real thing here is that you should be leveraging government-backed financing to maximize your investment, right? Like, why would you want to swim upstream, work against the current when you can go the easy route? Or in more simple terms, as I like to say, you know, I'm sure many people on this call as well, because probably a lot of high net worth individuals interested in investing here, the government has been, you know, screwing us in lots of ways for a long time. And I'm sure many people in here pay a heck of a lot of taxes and feel like they don't get a lot for it. So why not take advantage of the one opportunity where the government makes it very, very easy to build wealth? And that's really with this program. So the question then becomes, why isn't everybody doing this? You're probably thinking that right now, Jake, if this is such a good thing, how come I haven't heard of it? Or how come everyone I know is not doing this already, right? And I think the answer to that is extremely simple. Number one, there's no restriction on who can do this. It's not like you need a special license. You don't need to be some accredited guy. You don't need to pay a big fee and know the right people in the government. This program is open to any Canadian. But you have to think about what it is we're talking about here. We're talking about building a building, whether that's a sixplex little infill site or whether that's a multi-phase 100, 200, 300 unit community. The word building is a big word. Lots of people want to be a landlord. Very few people want to be a builder. Being a landlord, if you set things up properly, is a nearly passive, nearly completely hands-off thing, right? If you have good property management, you have a good bookkeeper, accountant in place, what are you doing? You're meeting with your property manager every couple months to verify things are going well, do your taxes at the end of the year. That's about it. Being a builder, before we even get into the building part, it's incredibly risky. Let's just talk about the land acquisition, right? You have to know where to pick up sites. You have to know, will the city be easy and helpful in getting this approved, or are they going to make a huge fuss? And you have to realize that oftentimes CMHC, being a federal company, what they want does not align with what the city wants in that particular piece of land. So you need to also find sites and design opportunities for those sites that can work with both parties. So basically, you have to be able to pick the right piece of land in the first place. Then you have to navigate the complexities of dealing with the municipality to get approvals, right? All the way to building permit. And then you have to hope that what you've designed can work financially to make sense for that CMHC application and hit that 110% coverage or better. Then you have to actually build it. And that's where things get really ugly, because if you don't know what you're doing in construction, we all know that's a cutthroat industry, right? So the trades, the suppliers, everyone along is going to smell that blood in the water, and they are going to absolutely kill you. So the reason that everyone and their brother and their sister doesn't do this is simply because being a builder is really hard to do well. Being a landlord, easy. Builder, hard. And my guess is there's probably 100 landlords for every one builder in Canada. So that's what's really going on. This program is actually being used like crazy. In fact, 22, 23, and 24 were the 3 highest dollar volume usage years of CMHC MLI Select in history of the entire country. But who's doing it? It's the rich getting richer, per se, right? The overwhelming majority of the utilizers of this program are the big builders and the big landowners. If people are here know, Tridel, for example, they're kind of a household name in Toronto. Well, the Delzato family builds MLI projects for themselves every year. So do the Menkeys, so do the Pemberton families. These giant builder families are able to do that because they already have that machine in place. They have, Tridel has 500 full-time employees dedicated to delivering buildings. So for them, whether they build a condo or build an MLI, it's flipping a switch. Challenge is, you will never be able to buy that building. Tridel's not building that to sell it. They're building it for their great grandkids' future, right? So the problem is for the me and the you of the world that this amazing opportunity is generally very inaccessible for most people who want to get in and become a landlord. So we kind of realized about a year ago that there might be an opportunity, right? We realized there's a bit of a niche or a hole in the market that we could potentially fill. And that kind of came from, again, going back to my silly childhood story about how all we did was talk about commercial real estate and being involved in owning and running multiple apartment buildings over my life and over my family's life. And then the other side of the equation being that we've been selling a lot of pre-construction for the last decade. And we kind of had a light bulb moment where we said, why can't we sell an entire apartment building the way we sell pre-construction, right? And if you think about that experience for a minute, let's go back to Tridel. If you want to buy a Tridel condo tomorrow, you walk into their sales center, they give you the tour, they give you the nice package, the brochure, the price list, all that stuff, and you say, I love this unit, right? They tell you it's $600,000, and all you have to do at that point is sign one contract, give them a few checks, and that's it. You don't have to think about anything else until a few years later when Tridel gives you a call and says, hey, your unit's ready, you're closing in 2 months, congratulations, right? You don't have to think about how did Tridel get this piece of land, which believe me, they probably bought 4 to 7 years prior to that sales center being open. You don't have to think about how much money and pain and torture they went through to get the city to approve what they wanted there, how much millions of dollars they paid their architects and engineers and designers. You don't have to worry about how much they're paying their concrete formers or their steel workers or their window installers or their kitchen installers. You don't even have to worry about what their overall construction budget is. All you know is you gave them $600,000, and a few years later, they're going to give you the keys to a finished, clean unit. And if there's any issues with it, it has a warranty, right? Whether Tridel made millions on that building lost millions or broke even is of no fundamental concern to you whatsoever. So why can't we sell apartment buildings the exact same way? Instead of a single condo unit, here's your whole building. And that's essentially exactly what we've kind of come up with and has been going absolutely crazy for us over the last year with a lot of happy purchasers, is that's what we offer. We have buildings, whether that's simple little sixplexes all the way up to 150, 200 unit, 300, even right now I'm working on a potential 450 unit project. Projects from $1.5 million up to $200 million and everything in between. And we handle the whole process on a fixed price, guaranteed delivery with the CMHC approval process all handled. And then even further than a Tridel, we then have the people in place to actually lease the building up, stabilize it, and then manage the property on an ongoing basis. So just like that Tridel experience, all that the buyer is responsible for is signing the paperwork, putting in the deposits, and then again, depending on the project, from a few months to a few years later, kind of getting the keys to the shiny new building. Except most of our buyers will never even take the keys because they're going right to the property management company, right? And they're just doing quarterly or half-year reports to find out how the financial situation is there. So that's kind of what we are doing, is we're filling that gap. We realize that we can engineer product that makes sense, everything from tiny little sixplexes up to these large-scale multiplexes that get picked up by large landlord families or private REITs and that sort of thing. So how do you, as an investor, qualify for a program like this? Because you're probably thinking, oh my God, like as I mentioned, buying a big building, it must be so complicated. It must be the most challenging thing ever. Like only the rich and powerful can do that kind of thing. But as I mentioned at the beginning, it's actually easier to buy any building 5 units or more than to buy 1 or 2 or 3 unit buildings or homes that are split up and that sort of thing. In fact, this applies generally whether it's CMHC or not. It's actually easier because when you're buying 1 unit or buying 2 units, the bank is still heavily looking at your income, right? They're only counting some of that rental income, maybe 25 or 30 or 50% if you're lucky. When you get into buildings over 5 units, they are only looking at the building's income. Your personal income has nothing to do with it. They just want to ensure that you have the equity and the liquidity to ensure the project can be completed. Whether your T4 shows $1 a year or $1 million a year makes absolutely no difference to them. That's why they're spending so much time analyzing the project, right? That's why they want to see that the project cash flows 110% of its mortgage payment, because they don't care what you make. Because think about it, on a big building, $100 million building, no one could ever make enough personal income to pay the mortgage. It's all going to be paid for by the building and supported by the building. So all they want to see is that you have the deposit. Now, if it's a 95-5 deal, you need to have that 5% cash down, right? They also want to see that you have 5% liquid accessible in case of kind of emergency or that kind of thing. Now, the way we structure our deals, you don't really need this in terms of you're never going to really run into this problem where we're going to say, hey, you need the liquidity, but CMHC requires that it's available because they don't understand how we're doing this. We're just utilizing their program, right? And they want to see that you have a total net worth of 25% of the project value. Now, someone smart the other day recognized I wrote cost here and project here and project here. They're the same thing. It's just my brain typing and I kind of made a silly mistake. It's all the percentages are based on the overall project value, okay? So really simple numbers. Let's talk about a $2 million project, which might be like an 8-plex or a 10 or something like that, a 6-plex to an 8-plex kind of size. You need $100,000 for the deposit. They want to see that you have access to another $100,000 if needed, and you have to have a net worth of around $500,000. That is it. You don't need to have any big income. You don't need to have perfect credit. That's it. That's really all that it requires. Now, there are a few little, asterisks and stars on that. When I say you don't need to have perfect credit, if your credit is abysmal, like if you have a 200 credit score, they're going to have a lot of questions, right? But if you have a 650 or a 700 or a 620, 630, it's probably not a big deal. When CMHC is looking at your profile, they're more trying to paint a picture. Is this a responsible person who can operate a business, right? So if they see that you have nonstop late payments or non-payments, that could be a problem, right? But if it's just that you don't have a lot of credit because you moved here or you missed one payment one time and you can explain it away, not going to be a big issue. You cannot have past due taxes or anything like that. So they will want a year's tax returns to make sure you're current with the CRA. And they're going to look into if you have any like open lawsuits or bankruptcies or judgments, again, because they're trying to see that you are a responsible person. If they're going to lend you $1 million or $5 million or $20 million to go build a building, they want to know that you have some semblance, right? They're not saying you have to be an expert in this because we already put those consultants in place, but they want to know that when a bill comes due, you're not going to forget about it. You're going to send the check to the hydro company or whoever it is. But again, the real takeaway here is your personal income is not considered. Many people did not have my dining room talks where I learned this when I was 5 years old, that commercial lending operates differently, right? In fact, many people would not know that when you have a commercial loan like this, it's not going to show up on your credit report at all. So you could go out tomorrow and buy a $20 million building where you put $1 million down and have a $19 million mortgage. And the very next day, you can go and buy a $2 million house in Toronto for yourself. And the bank's not even going to know that you have a $19 million mortgage that you got the day before, because that loan is secured against the property and it's secured against the company that owns that property. It is not secured against you. It's not on your credit bureau. So that big problem that a lot of serial investors are having that have been doing what I call retail investing, buying a condo here, a house there, where they can't get mortgages anymore, right? Because it doesn't matter. Even if you make $1 million a year, the bank doesn't want to give you more than 5, maybe 6 mortgages. It gets very challenging. Does not apply in commercial lending. You can do 100 of these. You can do 100 of these back to back. In fact, you can even apply twice at the same time using your net worth of 25% 2 times, and the bank will not be upset about it. So it's a whole different ballgame in commercial lending. And it's quite eye-opening for a lot of people when they realize how much better the commercial side of the equation is than the personal side of the equation. So let's just summarize it, right? You're getting government-backed loans. Up to 95% of it is loan, and you only need to come up with 5%. You get to spread that out over 50 years. You get to save that interest rate if you want for up to 10. You can do 5, but you can do it for 10, right? So I would, depending on what the rate is like when you lock in, you might choose one or the other. You're getting rates that are slightly over the 5-year Canada bond rate. So you're paying interest rates lower than anyone else. You have a third party out there giving you a sanity check who has no vested interest in the project. And the actual builders are doing this on a fixed price deal. So it's really kind of like a how can you lose situation, right? Like everything is being set up and lined up to minimize the risk. But there's actually more to this program. And when I said at the beginning of this that there's the opportunity to build real wealth, well, you might be like, okay, Jake, you're exaggerating a bit. You know, owning one sixplex, it's definitely better than buying a condo or buying a house and renting it out, but it's not going to make me into a billionaire, right? But this part of the program that I'm about to announce, the pari passu lending, is how you can literally become a billionaire starting with a sixplex. And if you think I'm exaggerating, I'm going to give you an example at the end of this. Pari passu is a Latin term, which means equal footing, okay? If you're a realtor in this room, you would have learned about this in probably course 1 or course 2 back in the day, but you probably forgot. In fact, until I saw this in CMHC about a year ago, I had forgotten that I would learned it about 10 years ago. But nonetheless, why is this important? CMHC allows equal footing second loans. That means that, remember, at the beginning of this process, we're talking about 95% loan to cost, not value. And I'm going to show you some appraisals after, because these things typically appraise up. So let's say you build your $2 million building and you get an appraisal for 2.2 million or 2.3 million. Well, now what? You're not really at 95%. There's all this sitting equity. You have $300,000 of new equity created there. But you can't break this 10-year loan, because if you broke your 10-year mortgage, there'd be huge penalties, right? So what CMHC does is you can essentially top up your mortgage by getting a second mortgage with them, shown from the appraisal, up to 95% of the value as appraised once the building is done. But because they treat the second mortgage with equal footing, it's at the same ultra low interest rates. Because, you know, normally if you get a second mortgage, it's going to be 8%, 9%, 10%. It's going to be a private lender at 12% or something like that. But it would be whatever the rate is in CMHC times at that time, still down in the 3s or the 4s or the 2s or whatever it is. So what does that mean? You can at least, in most cases, pull out your initial 5% investment and put it somewhere else. You can own an apartment building with $0 invested, okay? And you might be saying that doesn't make any sense, or that's crazy. How can that be? But think about it for a minute. How do you think the guys that own 5,000 doors got there? or the guys that own 10,000 doors, the billionaires, the 100 millionaires. Like, do you think they were just making a lot of money? And what were they, a professional sports player, like an athlete? Like, even if you were making $20 million a year, you can't buy enough apartment buildings to become a billionaire. It would take you 100 years. All these guys that have made literal generational wealth have done it through equity takeout. And when you're using CMHC, you get the best equity takeout program on the planet that you don't get in any other commercial lending. At minimum, if you can pull out your deposit and you're buying a simple little sixplex that's done in 6 months, that means that you could be buying 2 sixplexes a year, never using $1 more than your original investment. That means that if you just did that, okay, that means that over a 10-year period, you could own 120 units starting with your original investment. And all of those doors are cash flow positive the whole time. Because in reality, you'll never be able to go all the way up to the 95% value on the pullout, because you'd pull out so much money that you'd kill the cash flow. So you probably end up at like 90 or 91 or something like that. But as long as you can get your original deposit out, you're now able to go and reinvest it into another building. And you can just keep doing that cycle over and over and over again. And as the rents continue to rise over time, you can keep going back, reappraising your portfolio and pulling out more and more and more to buy more. You can be as, safe or as risky as you want with that, how aggressive you want to be. Not everyone wants to be a billionaire. Some people, if they made $1 million, they're happy. If they make 10 million, they're happy. But I'm going to tell you a story, and I'm going to use real names because this guy's sort of a public figure, and you can Google it and you can see his portfolio. So it's not like I'm, outing him for who he is. But one of my dad's friends and early clients, a guy that came to this country in the 1970s, an Italian immigrant, has no high school education. He came here barely with a grade 8 education, could barely speak English, and started working as a concrete former in the late 70s, early 80s. Okay, he saved up all of his money because he saw real estate was a good place to put it, and he saved up and he bought himself some dinky little rundown apartment building in the Niagara region. And because he was a concrete former and a bit of a handyman, he was able to do a lot of the work and repairs himself, which gave him a little bit of a leg up. But he was essentially able to improve this building, go to his appraiser, get a higher appraisal, pull that equity out, and go buy another building, okay? And he started doing that in the early 80s. Today, he still operates his business. He's in his 70s. His name's Angelo Butera. He owns Panoramic Properties, and they have $3.2 billion, with a B, $3.2 billion of assets under their management, okay? Mostly focused in the Niagara region and in the Sudbury area. But just think about that, okay? Next time you say whatever I'm talking about is not possible, or whatever I'm talking about must only be for the rich and the connected, this guy came here, couldn't speak English, never graduated past grade 8, started working as a concrete worker, and 35, 40 years later, he's worth $3 billion. And he's probably the most important land developer, builder, and landlord in the entire Niagara region. If you ask any other builder, they all know Angelo. Everyone can do this. Do they need to be worth $3 billion? Maybe, maybe not. But they can use this program of pulling out that equity and refinancing to keep going. Another one of my good friends, who's actually in Edmonton, that I'm going to be seeing tomorrow, they are constantly building an equity taking out 6plexes, 8plexes, 10plexes. They build 20 of these things a year for themselves. They are their own building operation, so they don't need me. But they're able to turn over that equity. They keep the asset, and within 6 or 7 months, they've pulled out their money and they go build another one. Every year, they're building 10, 20 of these things and just building up this portfolio. The goal is to get to 1,000 doors or so and then sell the whole thing to a REIT. So this is what I meant when I say, you guys, the majority of people in this room have been trained that you have to save your money, you have to pay off your mortgage, you shouldn't talk about money, you shouldn't talk about how much you earn. But that training has handicapped you completely. What you should have been getting taught is how to use leverage, how to increase your mortgage to buy more. I just did another deal. I'm actually out here primarily for this purpose. The purchaser paid, it was a $48 million apartment building that we're building for him here, about 150 units. Now, we rejigged it a bit because he wanted to add some more residential, get rid of the commercial. It's not super important to the story. But what ended up happening is after we switched it to about 180 units, the value went up a bit to about 50 million. But he came to me and said, Jake, I don't want to pay 50 million. I want to pay 51 million. Why does he want to pay 51 million? Because the cash flow can support the larger mortgage. If he pays 50 million, he puts a deposit of 2.5 million. If he pays 51 million, he puts a deposit of 2.55 million. Only 50,000 more comes out of his own pocket. But guess what? On that extra million, we list him as a development consultant on the project, and he takes a fee from the construction loan and puts it back in his pocket. So what does that mean at the end of the day? By the time the building is done, he's already recovered 1 million of his deposit. So he raised the price. He makes a little less cash flow in the short run, but immediately, instead of him having 2.55 million in, he only has 1.55 million in. And that frees up that extra $1 million for him to go do it again. And his goal now, he wants to buy 1 or 2 of these every single quarter, basically in perpetuity. So that's about changing the mindset of how you think in terms of commercial lending. You don't want to pay down your mortgage. You don't want to sell these off. You want to use these programs to maximize the amount of real estate you can purchase in any given time frame. It's like playing the game with cheat codes on, right? I mean, again, you have an Italian immigrant with no education who becomes a billionaire, and it's not luck. It's not luck at all. It's playing the game with the cheat codes. And this can be done with or without CMHC MLI. But under normal lending, you're at 25.75 down. With CMHC, you can go up to 95.5. 25.75 means that you're at 4 times leverage, right? 95.5 means you're at 20 times leverage. If you're at 20 times leverage, your returns go through the absolute roof. And that's why the smart money is using this program at the $1 billion scale. So why not join them at the hundreds of thousands or $1 million scale to start building that kind of wealth for yourself? I know I am, right? I know I am. But that's all. This next thing was an announcement from my brokerage, so it's not important to show you. So what I'm going to show you now, for anyone who doesn't believe me, is I'm going to show you 2 buildings, 2 nice little packages I have here. I'm going to show you a big project and a small project. When I say a big project, that's typically a building over $20 million in size. When I say a small project, I'm talking about stuff that's like 1 or like 2, 3, 4 million, sort of the size that any investor can kind of start with if they want to get into this type of product, right? And I'm going to show you a little bit of real life backup on this stuff to really make you understand that I'm not just making this stuff up as I go along. So for those, I'm actually in Edmonton right now. I'm not too far away from this site, but this site is in Blatchford, Edmonton. And this area called Blatchford is kind of like, if people from Toronto here are on the call, it's like Downsview Park. It used to be the Edmonton Airport, and the city kind of took it back and put out a proposal to redevelop it into like a futuristic, modern, energy efficient community for 30,000 residents. And then they moved the airport somewhere else. So far, it's like halfway through, kind of like Downsview, where it's still under development. There's a bunch of towns being built, and then now they're getting into the multiplex stuff. These buildings are kind of the first 4 multiplex to be built on this site. So what is this building? I'll skip over some of the info on CMHC, but this building is a 92-unit project, and this location is near the LRT, near the NAIT campus, the mall. It's a really cool little spot. And I just want to also mention this building is sold firm. And it's already been approved by CMHC. So we know that the financing is in place and it's basically good to go. So the example I'm showing you is not some speculative. It's going to be starting construction in the spring, just because, you know, with winters out here and the hard ground and stuff, it's easier for them to get started in the spring. But I want you to understand that this is not some speculative hope and dream. This building is sold firm to a very happy buyer, and it's already approved for the construction financing, and they're going to have shovels in the ground as soon as it melts in the spring. So most of these packages contain a lot of this kind of like, you know, whenever we create these for people, a lot of information about the neighborhood and the area and who the builder is. I'm not going to spend too much time on that here because this is a 17-page package, and if I went through it in detail, we'd spend another hour. What really matters in here is kind of getting into the meat and potatoes, the numbers of it, right? But here's where you can see kind of where it is by the university. You can kind of see how this still looks like an airport a little bit, and where this is kind of centered in Edmonton.
The lights went out on the streets of Highland Park, Michigan. A passion for another light source, the sun.
Oh, someone has some sound on there if they want to mute themselves. Alexander, maybe. There you go. Okay. So again, I call this neighborhood kind of like a Yonge and Eglinton, if you were comparing it to Toronto. It's not, you can see downtown is right along the river. We're not quite downtown. We're not also out in the middle of nowhere. Okay. This is what the building looks like. This is very typical product in Alberta, 4 to 6 story wood frame or steel frame construction. Some of the keys with something like this are that we minimize the underground. It's either no underground, or in this case, 1 level of underground. We're trying to de-risk these projects. We're not, when you get into concrete, when you get into high rise, when you get into digging 4 or 5 stories underground, You add a lot of time, a lot of risk, a lot of cost. When you're building simple wood or steel frame buildings with no underground or one level, these things go up fast. You remove a lot of the risk. You keep your costs low, which is the key. Remember, these are rentals. We're not building the Shangri-La for your personal lifestyle. So let's get into what really matters here, which is the numbers. And again, this project was sold back in, when was it? August? I think it was the end of July or August. So the numbers on the mortgage are a little out of date because rates have come down significantly, but that will make the project look even better. So in this example, we've just cleaned up the pro forma to make it less confusing by just essentially having a single average rent. But in reality, this is 1 beds, 2 beds, 3 beds. We just made it simpler so that you're not looking at an overwhelming amount of information. Needless to say, the average rent in this building is going to generate approximately $1.9 million of rent per year. Then you have some parking, some pet fees, generating some additional revenue. Now, you might be wondering, what are pet fees? Because I haven't even gotten into the benefits of Alberta yet. Alberta has a much more fair landlord-tenant situation than Toronto or than Ontario. You can charge for anything there, basically. It's like true capitalism. If you want to charge extra for someone to have pets, you can go crazy. If you want to charge security deposits, go for it. As well, you can evict people in 14 days, 2 weeks, if they don't pay their rent. So it makes things, your bad debt and vacancy, you can be much lower versus Ontario, where you might have someone that you can't get rid of for 8 or 9 months, right? So needless, when you add all this up, you're looking at about $2 million of total revenue. And then you have your indexed expenses. These are either real expenses from buildings nearby, or they are pulled from CMHC's sort of standard database, or they are already contracted expenses. So it's not like we're just making this up, right? And these are legitimate expenses. And of course, as I mentioned, this project's being approved by CMHC. So they must, believe what we're offering essentially. But what you'll see here is you have your property taxes, insurance, utilities, repairs and maintenance, management and salaries. A big building like this is going to have a property manager and it's going to have a full-time site super, right? So you have both in there, additional miscellaneous costs and a replacement reserve. When you're doing proper pro formas, I see so many realtors out there and I look at what they offer, a cash flow analysis on a house that you can rent out or a condo you can rent out. I see property taxes and insurance. How is that proper, right? Like, look at how many line items we actually have here, the proper amount of expenses that exist on a building, including a proper reserve for repairs in the future, replacing a roof, replacing a boiler system, that sort of thing. End of the day, you end up with a net operating income of around 1.4 million. And with a $23 million loan on this project, you end up with a cash flow of about 304,000. Now, this, as I mentioned, was run at 4.25. This buyer is not locked in their rate yet because their rate will lock in much later on in this process. Right now, the lending is around 3.5, 3.6. Maybe it'll go even lower by the time they lock in. If I pulled out the Excel sheet and run this at 3.5, cash flow goes over 500,000. That's just icing on the cake for the purchaser. But I want to think about this in simple numbers, okay? We're going to go to the next page here, which has kind of the breakdown. The original purchase price here was 24.5 million. This one was a little bit more than 5%. It ends up at around 7% deposit required, just the way it worked out. But needless to say, you end up owning an entire apartment building for 7% down. Forget the appreciation expectations and don't even look at the 10 or 20 year because it's highly speculative. How can we know what happens 20 years from now? But just look at what happens over 5 years with the cash flow and the mortgage repayment. You're looking at $2.6 million over the first 5 years of cash and mortgage pay down. Your deposit is only $1.6 million. Show me one other investment right now where you can make almost 2 times your deposit in the first 5 years in pretty much bedrock solid numbers. I'm not talking about appreciation. I'm not talking about speculation and price increases. I'm talking about the rents that are available today and the mortgage pay down. That's a simple formula. Where else can you double your deposit in 5 years on a real estate investment right now? Because if you bought a condo in Toronto and you put a down payment, not only are you not cash flowing, you're probably losing $2,000 a month. Now let's talk about the estimated market appreciation, because you might go, Jake, there's no way this building is going to be worth $33.8 million in 5 years. But I'd like you to look up here, current appraised value, $29.2 million. Here's the appraisal. I don't make these things up, guys. This building is appraised at $29 million. 7704 York Mews, right? This building right here. Oh, this is the one across the street, but it's this day. There's two matching buildings. The point is, we are building these buildings below the actual market value. And what you'll typically see is that the market will build in about a 10 to 20% risk premium for the construction. So these buildings are typically around a 5 cap rate, whereas the market for a brand new, independently metered, modern construction building might be closer to a 4 cap rate. So this appreciation, this is not even appreciation. This is just the built-in lift for building one of these buildings. This one is 24 million to 29 million. We did another one on the University of Alberta campus, a slightly larger building, 34 million construction, 40 million appraisal. Okay. There's so much lift available in these that right away on day one, you've made this massive upside. So assuming that this building ends up at 33 million over 5 years, which when you realize that it's currently valued at 29 million, doesn't seem like such a stretch, you're potentially looking at a return of almost $12 million on your initial investment of 1.5 million on day one. And if that seems like, okay, that's cool, that's great. I'm glad that guys can afford, 90 unit buildings are going to get richer. But we do the exact same thing on the small ones. Here's a project sold today. This is actually sold to one of my own agents who's very, very excited about it, that he bought it. It's a little sixplex. It's $1.8 million for him to purchase. Here's a cash flow analysis on it. This is in North Edmonton. CYB stands for CY Becker, which is a little community in Edmonton. Basically, here's your unit breakdown. This one is basically, it's just 3 lots, detached homes with a basement unit legal. We do that on this type of project as well. In fact, most of our smaller ones are kind of built this way, right? Anyway, you end up with about $134,000 of cash flow. Here's your expenses, all generated from the CMHC broker as well, right? And essentially, you end up with your net operating, your net expenses, your operating income of about $99,000. Here's your mortgage, underwritten at 3.8%. On the smaller projects, you usually get a little bit higher rate. Right now, on a big project like that Blatchford, you might get down into 3.6, 3.7. But regardless, you end up with a yearly mortgage of $77,000 and a cash flow after paying the debt of $22,000 a year. Let's look at the top of this again. The deposit on this is $90,000. You're making $22,000 of cash flow. That's a 25% cash flow return. And going back to that little debt service coverage ratio, the minimum CMHC wants is 1.1. This is 1.3. So what does that mean? That means that even if rates went up, or even if the rental market got softer, you have a 30% margin from this projection that you're not going to be in a cash flow negative position. Extremely safe. Here's the best part about this one. When I was flying to Edmonton today, I was talking with our underwriter, and I got to see if I can pull up the screenshot. But essentially, this is already now being like preliminarily appraised by the appraiser at 2.08 million. So my buyer, my friend, my agent, I'm not going to name his name, it's public, but he's already up $200,000 on this. Having so far, he's only sent in the initial hold deposit of like $5,000, and he's up 200,000 appraised value. We're trying to get his mortgage. By the time he actually closes on this building, we are pushing to get his mortgage to 1.8 million, meaning that he might end up owning this with $0 in the deal. So just let that sink in for a minute. Now, if we push the mortgage up to 1.8 million, the cash flow is going to drop a bit. It'll probably drop to like 10,000, 11,000, but he'll own a building that's cash flowing for free. And then he can go and take his 90,000 and he can do it again, and he can do it again, and he can do it again. So it's not a thing where you have to look at a Blatchford and go, okay, cool, it works on a $30 million project, but I'm the little guy. This is for the little guy, right? I mean, I have real world example after real world example. One of my own agents, he bought two 10plexes, one in Edmonton, one in Calgary last year. Back then, prices were a little lower. On the day he got the keys, both, and you can message him on this. I'll give you his number after I ask him permission. Anyone in this group can talk to him. I have his appraisals. I have his purchase agreements. The day he got his keys, both of them were fully rented. Both of them are cash flow positive day one. And he got appraisals on both of them, each one up about 500,000. So he only had to put in about 130,000 deposit per, so 260K in, and he's up $1 million, and both of them are cash flow positive. And he's in the process now of doing that refinance to pull that equity out because he wants to go and buy two more. I mean, who wouldn't want to, right? it's story after story like this. My personal favorite is just, it's kind of like this CY Becker, but it's a different location in Edmonton, a less desirable neighborhood, let's say. A really good deal, $1.4 million sixplex, which we'll never see prices like that again. But this guy picked up a 1.4 sixplex for $70,000. If you think about $70,000, like I'm not saying that's not a lot of money, but that's like a Honda Accord. Okay, anyone that's on this call should be able to come up with $70,000 in terms of real estate investment. It's an unbelievably small amount of money. It's cash flowing $20,000 a year for him. It's finished, fully rented for a year now. Cash flowing $20,000 a year, and he has an appraisal in hand at 1.63 million. So that guy was in for 70K, and he's up 230. Very similar story to Tafiq. Or sorry, whoops, I accidentally said who's the buyer here. My mistake. I will be in trouble later. But story to this, except this is at 1.8. This guy, right? So we're just seeing story after story where we're producing positive cash flow for these guys, and we're getting those appraisals up so that we can pull that money out at the end and go rinse and repeat, right? And that's all I'm doing too. I just bought another sixplex 2 weeks ago, and I'm planning to buy basically one of these every 2 months, give or take, whenever I either have the money or whenever I'm able to get that equity pullout. So if you want to say, why aren't you investing? I am. I'm putting every extra dollar that I don't need to, pay my mortgage and keep the lights on into these CMHC deals, because in my opinion, it is the true only way to build actual generational wealth. Unless you get, you end up becoming a professional athlete or something like that. This is the only way. And similar idea here, here's the funny thing. I have a default in here of 10% lift. So in the year one, I'm showing that this building's worth 1.982. We actually already know that it's actually higher than that. It's about $20,000 higher, right? So that's when you look at this with the cash flow and everything else, you're making potentially $214,000, $220,000 on his initial deposit in that first year. Actually, this one will be ready. This was a quick closing. It'll be ready in April of 2025. So what's April from today? It's basically December. That's 5 months. So in 5 months, he's going to be able to equity take out. Hopefully we can take out his whole deposit. He'll still have a cash flow of $10,000, $11,000, and he'll own this thing basically for free, and he'll be able to go do it again. And if he keeps, I almost said his name again there, if he keeps doing that in cycle every 6 months to a year, in 5 or 10 years, he could basically retire if he wanted to, right? Or he could aggressively continue and build that up to being a multi-$100-million portfolio. And you can kind of see that over a 5-year period, if he just decided to hold this and let it appreciate, he potentially is seeing in the neighborhood of $800,000 equity on his $90,000 investment. And here we also run it against interest rate sensitivity, right? So number one, if rates went up or down 0.5%, you're still very healthily in the debt service coverage. And number two, if rents went up or down substantially, you're still healthily cash flow positive. So it's really a scenario where how can you lose, right? I mean, the only real risk in this, because everything has risk, I'm not here to sugarcoat anything. The only real risk in these types of deals is the construction itself. And that's why the market has a premium on the construction. But that is mitigated in 2 ways. Number one, make sure you're working with good builders. And we're only working with the best builders that we vet and are comfortable with, that have a long track record of never having failures, never canceling projects, most importantly, not going bankrupt, and that have been in the business so long that we're confident in how well capitalized they are, how much cash they have available. And number two, especially on these smaller projects, these are done only using the CMHC mortgage. They're not done using the loan for construction. The builder is building this with his own money and then only using CMHC for the closing. So it works almost like a normal pre-construction. The deposits are either held in a lawyer's trust account, or on some freehold deals, they're held in the builder's account, but then they're insured by the warranty program, right? Just like in Toronto, where in Toronto it's Terrion, in Alberta, it's the Alberta New Home Warranty Program, but the exact same thing, that deposit's insured. So even in a worst case scenario, if the builder went bankrupt, your deposit's protected. On the big projects where you're using the land loans and everything else, you end up owning the land at the beginning of the process. The deposit and the first part of the loan is used to sell the land to you. So at that point, you have the security of owning the land. The builder is then building on your land. So what would happen in that case if a builder went broke? Well, it wouldn't be a pretty situation, but you have to remember that you own the land, you own whatever work was completed so far, you have the rights to all the plans and designs, and you still have the loan in place to build the rest of the building. So it would become a scramble to get a replacement contractor in basically to finish the project. Would it be a headache? Absolutely. Would it be some long sleepless nights? Probably. But it's not like you're losing everything. It's like we scramble and find a replacement builder to finish the project. That being said, we've never had a bankruptcy. We've never had a builder not finish a job. We're very careful in our selection. If I do this for 100 years and I do thousands of projects, will it happen? I mean, statistically, of course, it would eventually, but we would do everything we can to mitigate it up front. And if it happened 1 out of 1,000 times, as long as that project gets finished, all's well that kind of ends well, right? So we de-risk these things as much as humanly possible. And then the other side of the risk would be, again, what happens if rents go down? What happens if interest rates go up? Well, again, we run sensitivity against that, right? On a small project like this that's closing in 5 months, how much are rates going to move in 5 months? Plus or minus 0.5 point is a very reasonable estimate, right? How much could rents move in 5 months? Even here, I'm running it down to 7%, but it's very clear to me that at 7%, it's still very cash flow positive. You could probably run this down to minus 20% rents before it broke even. And the thing I'd say about that as well is if you believe rents are going to fall off the face of the earth, then you can't buy any investment. It doesn't matter whether it's a CMHC, it doesn't matter if it's a resale or a pre-construction, it doesn't matter if it's a whole apartment building or a single condo, because if you don't have faith in the long run of the Canadian rental market, then you shouldn't be investing in real estate, period. But time and time again, over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, the guys who went long on rental properties have done better than just about anything, right? And if you go back to the very beginning where it says more millionaires are made in real estate than anything else, I mean, all of my money is in real estate. Every time I put money in the stock market, if I try to play around or do a tip, I kind of lose. But in real estate, over the long run, you always do well. And yes, absolutely, in a single year or 2 years or 3 years, prices can go up, prices go down, rents go up, rents go down. But when you're holding these things for the long run, you will always come out ahead unless there is some sort of fundamental shift in the Canadian economy, right? So that's kind of what we wanted to talk about today. I hope you guys found it somewhat interesting, and I'm sorry that I lost the internet there halfway through. I'll open it up if anyone has any questions. You can either shout them out there on if you want, you can just write it in the chat, whichever you feel comfortable with.
Thanks very much, Jake. For the listeners, how long does the CMHC process take? How long? And also for the investors that want, to prefer, a turnkey investment opportunity, they don't want to go through, filling forms with CMHC. Who takes care of that? And is there a service cost for that service?
Yeah, so CMHC approval is going to vary depending on the project type. Small little projects, quick as like 60 days for approval. Large complex buildings like a Blatchford could be up to around 6 months for approval because the amount of underwriting on a large deal is obviously substantially more. All of the costs associated with like our work is all built into our price, right? Like obviously we're making a profit on doing this, as we should, because we're adding a value, but it's all built in. The only additional costs which may exist, and it varies from deal to deal, because the way CMHC lends, there's a couple fees that have to be paid out of pocket, but they can often be recuperated in the loan at a later time. So one is the CMHC application fee. It's not a big deal. It's $200 a door. So on a sixplex, it's $1,200. Even on a 100-unit building, it's only $20,000. So relative to the size of the building, the application fee is pretty irrelevant. The other fee would be the broker fee to the mortgage broker, which is the only component I haven't discussed here. Depending on the broker and depending on the size of the deal, that fee would range from 0.5% to 1% of the total loan, which is just a typical commercial lending broker fee. Now, because CMHC does not open the loan until you've started construction, or if you're only using the mortgage until you're actually closing the deal, someone has to pay that fee up front, which would be the buyer. But then in most cases, we can build those fees back into the actual budget so that they can be recuperated by the loan over time. So those are really the only two extra fees you might run into. Now, in terms of the paperwork and stuff, we don't want you guys filling that out because the application process of CMHC is incredibly complex. It's a lot of work. Like when the underwriters and the broker puts this together, he might put 40 to 60 hours of work into this application, because if he doesn't do, or he or she doesn't do a good job, it's all riding on how well they present the project to that underwriter at CMHC, right? So they are going to have you do the bare minimum. There's certain things you have to fill out. They don't know your net worth. They can't go in CRA and get your tax returns for you. So they're just going to give you a list of things you need to get. But once you supply that list to them, you're basically hands off. You're doing like 1 hour of work, collecting all the stuff you would do for any mortgage, and they're doing the rest. Let me just go through some of the questions I see in the chat there. Can we own under a holding corporation? Yes. It is not a requirement, but I would never even be willing to sell one of these to someone if they wanted to put it in their personal name. When you're owning a big building, there's so much liability. Like God forbid if the building burnt down, right? You don't want that attached to your personal name. You need to isolate that liability in a corporation. Also, if your goal is to build wealth, having these things held in corporation allows you to do intercorporate loans and stuff like that to buy more or move money around. So you would always want to put this in a corp. My recommendation is that you'd have an individual corporation for every building, because that gives you the maximum isolation from taxes and liability. The QF Capital asked if there was bridge loans needed. You might have heard that because there's different structures to these deals. So the one thing CMHC does not do is they do not do land loans. Now you might be confused because I just said that they do land loans. They do not do land loans on raw land, okay? They do land loans once you have an approved shovel-ready project and you need to buy the land and then build on it. So where you've probably heard that bridge loans are needed is if you're buying raw land that has not gone through planning or zoning process yet. There is no way to get CMHC involved on a raw land deal. So yes, many people do use a bridge loan when they're buying the land and then they're building it for themselves. The opportunities we're offering to you guys are all approved projects. So if you're buying it, you can use that land and construction loan from CMHC if it's going to be used. Will CMHC allow the mortgage to be variable? No. CMHC will insist that it is a locked rate. The risk on a variable mortgage is far, far too high, guys. You're talking about potentially on a big building, the loan could be $100,000 a month or more. You don't want that on a variable, right? Neither do they. They want to know that day one, if it's cash flow positive, that you have that 5 or 10 year run, cash flow positive. What's the name of the Italian immigrant in Ag region? That was already written in there. Kevin said, yes, you can do 5 or 10 year term lock. To the buyer, we are offering together with property management who will look after steps A to Z. I'm not 100% sure I understand the question there, but just to clarify, our group will ensure that every step A to Z is handled, right? So first of all, we're the ones organizing the opportunities in the first place. And then as soon as those contracts are signed and everything's done, the very next step is introducing the CMHC broker. And then he's going to work with you to get all that paperwork done. And then essentially we're just sitting on our hands waiting for the approval at that point. Once the building gets close to completion, that's when the property managers begin the lease up and stabilization phase. How can I contact CMHC broker? Can you recommend someone to me? Yes, we can. If you contact someone after this chat, however you got here, just reach out to that person and we can introduce you to a broker to discuss with. I also think it's excellent that anyone who's considering doing this, whether you're considering doing it with me or whether you want to do it yourself or just buy even a resale building and use this program, talk to a broker first to find out what your real buying capacity is, because a lot of people misunderstand what their net worth really is. We've run into deals before where someone thought their net worth was much higher than it was, right? So it's always good to get a sanity check. Any good broker will spend 20 minutes with you and go over what your actual capacities are. One note on that I forgot to mention in the presentation, your net worth must be Canadian assets. This is a Canadian program, right? So even if you have $100 million sitting in the US, right at the border on Detroit, CMHC doesn't see it. It's $0. It has to be Canadian assets. So Canadian houses, stocks and bonds and government accounts and Canadian banks, cash in Canadian banks, etc. It has to be Canadian assets. Are there any preferred banks for CMHC, or can we go to any nationalized bank? Not even just banks. There's a lot of CMHC lenders out there that are like insurance companies, pension funds, all these ICI bank, like tons of banks do this because remember, from the bank's perspective, they're getting insured lending. So they're lending money with almost no risk. So they really love it, right? So typically we work through the brokers. We don't go directly to the bank because I don't know how many of you have done other commercial lending, but banks are very rigid. If you go to a bank, they're coloring in the lines, right? And I'm not saying that we are doing anything against the rules or something that's unethical, but when you work with a mortgage broker, he's not a banker. He can be much more creative in how we construct the budgets and how we construct what we need to either get higher ratios or to get better terms or that kind of thing, right? So I've literally run into this before where we have used a bank rep to do lending and we've gotten lower ratios on the same project or the same site than when we go to a mortgage broker. So any project that we do, we will insist on the broker that gets used for it, because my biggest risk putting all this time and work into this is that it doesn't get approved, right? Then you think about it, I don't make any money if your building doesn't get approved. So it is essential that we select the people that are involved in this because we know they have a proven track record of delivering approvals with CMHC. What if the appraisal comes in lower once the project is ready? The appraisal is being done at the beginning of the application phase, right? So in terms of getting the approval and lending with CMHC, that's not an issue. If an appraisal later on came in lower, then there'd have to have been some fundamental shift in the market, which, you know, it could happen, I guess, but that's where, who cares? You're cash flowing, right? So that's what cash flow is so beautiful about. If the market goes down over the short run, who cares? Even if in like this example right here, the rents could drop 20% and you're still making money on the building. So for a year or two, you can't do the equity takeout because the market's bad. Okay, it sucks you were in the wrong timing on that deal, but you're not getting a wipeout of value. You know what does suck? When you're buying a pre-construction or you're buying, you know, in Toronto over the last couple of years where your only option was appreciation. And since these things haven't appreciated, people can't even close, right? Since your financing secured at the beginning of the process, you'll be able to close. And within a huge margin of error, you'll still be cash flowing. So you're extremely de-risked. And if, yeah, oh no, it's a bad year or two, we can't do the equity takeout. So you have 5% in there for a year or two, but you're cash flow positive. That's kind of your worst case scenario, right? Bob asked, can we buy as a group? The limit on a CMHC application is 100 applicants. Obviously, you would have to create a company with your group of friends or family or whatever, and you would assign your shares however you want to. All I can tell you is that every deal I've ever done that has 1 or 2 names on it has pretty much all worked out. Every deal I've ever done that has 4, 5, or 6 names on it has fallen apart. When you put too many cooks in the kitchen, it doesn't work so great, right? And I would always recommend, my personal life advice is pick your partners very carefully because bad partners can ruin an otherwise good deal. But yes, there's nothing stopping you from putting a group together, especially if you're trying to meet certain net worth requirements. Like let's say one guy's got a lot of cash, the other guy's got no cash but a lot of net worth. It might be a perfect partnership opportunity, right? We do not organize groups, just to be clear. We are not running a fund. We are not organizing groups of strangers to invest. We are selling these as freehold opportunities. You are buying the entire site. You are the only people on title. You are your group. We have no equity in your deal, right? So it's not a fund, but if you want to organize a group of people, that's totally fine. Do you get project which for sale and required renovation and fit for CMHC? That's not my area of expertise. There is definitely a profitable business to be made of that. But my area of expertise, what I've chosen to focus on is on the pre-construction space for a couple of reasons. One, I just have the experience in pre-construction. And 2, I'm a big believer that we can engineer a brand new building to maximize this program through having the right unit mixes and that sort of thing. Plus, I just prefer new things that don't have a lot of capital expenditure, right? I mean, there's a lot of guys who have made a lot of money doing this on old 1960s, 1970s buildings, but our area of expertise is the new stuff. Michael, we will give you a ring after the call. And then Mehdi's saying, if I understood, and correct me if I'm wrong, the fees are only mortgage broker and CMHC fee per door. Then how do you make money in all of this? Because we have a profit margin in building the buildings for you, right? No one's delivering buildings for free. So we're part of that delivery and construction process, and we take a fee from the budget for doing that. Are there opportunities in every province? This can be done. So I didn't get too into the weeds on why we focus heavily on Alberta, but CMHC is a federal corporation. They will lend and do these deals anywhere in Canada. We focus primarily in Alberta because I strongly believe that we can get the highest return on investment with the least headaches. So there's a lot of different reasons. Now, I am from Toronto. I live at Blue Jays Way in Wellington. I'm just in Edmonton for the week looking at more sites. I'm sure many of you have heard in the news that the average new home in Ontario has about 30% of the cost of it is fees and taxes, right? There's so many charges and fees in Ontario. You have land transfer tax, development charges, parkland dedications, other municipal fees, meter hookups, all of this crap, okay? In Alberta, mostly none of that exists. So in Ontario, already right off the bat, 30% of your cost is wasted cost. I can't rent a fee, right? Whereas in Alberta, maybe 95% of the cost is going to actual construction. I can rent constructible space. So right off the bat, it's a massive gap. The other reason why we prefer Alberta to Ontario is because of the affordable benchmark. So if you remember, we talked about CMHC benchmarks those rates. In Ontario, lots of Ontario, it's at $1,200 a month. So you have higher costs to build a building and a lower rent. How are you supposed to make money? In Alberta, Edmonton is $1,655 and Calgary is $1,738. It's almost so high that it's the market rates, right? So it's much, much easier. Now I am looking at stuff right now in Kelowna as well. Kelowna is a little bit in the middle. They have more fees and problems, but the rents are very high. And then we're also looking at some opportunities out on the East Coast. I'm actually looking at a deal in Halifax right now, but I just don't even know enough about Halifax. And before I would ever offer anyone in this call or otherwise, I need to do a ton of research first and understand the market. But it looks like a place that can work, right? But for me, I am very much a pure numbers guy, right? Like when I look at these packages, I don't even go through the brochure. I just go right to the numbers, because why do I care where my building is? Why do I care where my investment is in general, whether I'm buying a stock? Like if you're buying Apple stock, one of the most profitable companies in Canada in the history of the planet, they're in San Francisco. Do you care they're in San Francisco? Does it matter? No. Whether your building's in Alberta, whether it's in Vancouver, whether it's in Nunavut, why does it matter? The only thing that matters is there a need for housing? And do the prices for building it work well with the cost of the rents, right? And if those work, that's all that kind of matters, right? And like tomorrow, if there was a CMHC opportunity in Australia, they opened up a program and the return was higher, that's where I'd put my money. I'll put it wherever I can get the best return, and I think it's safe, right? So to me, and to be clear, I own apartment buildings in Toronto too. So some people say it's a comfort thing. I want to go see the building. I want to drive by. I own 2 apartment buildings in Scarborough. I have not physically seen them in person in over 5 years. I don't even really remember what they look like because they're property managed. Why do I need to go there? What benefit does it do, right? Now and then, maybe I'm in the neighborhood, I might want to drive by, but really I have no need to at all. We'll also like to talk more about this. Interested, said Elka. Okay, anytime. You can message me. You have my contact. Do you have any? You could deal with Alberta properties as an Ontario agent. No one cares. Nobody really cares about where you are or what kind of agent you are when you're talking about commercial real estate. The rules of what board or what area you work in really only apply to kind of resale transactions and working with the MLS systems in those regions. When it gets into commercial real estate, none of these deals are from MLS. None of these deals are public knowledge. They're all private off-market opportunities, just like a pre-construction deal. You don't even really need to technically be a licensed realtor to sell pre-construction. In fact, a lot of the pre-construction marketing companies are not even realtors. So it's not really important, or it's not really a concern because it's all off-market stuff. One other point I did not mention as well, I always forget because it's not actually part of CMHC, and then we'll wrap it up because it's getting late for everyone. But the other thing that kind of set this on fire, like pouring gas on the fire, was that 2 years ago, the Trudeau government announced a sales tax rebate on purpose-built rental buildings. So you can Google it if you type in GST rebate apartment buildings. They announced a 100% rebate. So compare that to the new housing credit, which caps out at around $24,000. If you buy a pre-construction anywhere in Canada, it caps out around $24,000. But when you build or buy a new apartment building, you get a 100% rebate on the GST or the HST, which means that, if you do this in Alberta alone, where they don't have HST, you're getting 5% off your price. If you do this in Ontario, you're getting 13% off your price, which that was just the gas on the fire that kind of made this thing go crazy. Do I see any impact if the government changes next year? Not over the short run. And I can get into politics for a long time. If any of you follow me on Instagram, I'm very politically loudmouth about my opinions on that. Number one, the Conservative government has been very, very much on the side of get housing built. And he's already taught, the leader, PP there, is already talking about tax cuts on new construction and that sort of thing. So if anything, I see him pushing for more incentives to deliver more housing. Now, the other side of that coin is that he'll probably cut immigration a bit. But let's talk about immigration, because obviously the demand for housing is heavily tied to how many people are coming into Canada. Let's put things in perspective. 2015 was the last year of Harper's government. And in that year, approximately 300,000 immigrants came to Canada, right? Justin Trudeau took over and he ramped up immigration substantially. Whether that's right or wrong for the country is a discussion we can all have over a beer some other time. But at the peak, which was basically this year, he ramped it up to 1.2 million immigrants per year. Now they've said they're going to cut it, the Liberal government, and a chance to hopefully save themselves, which isn't going to work, but they said they're going to cut it 20%. So if you go from 1.2 million with a 20% cut, that is 960,000. It's still 3.3 times, 330% higher than it was in the Harper last year. And in 2015, we were still in a housing crisis. In 2015, it was still 0 to 1% vacancies around this country, and it was still hard to rent, and prices were rising 10 or 15% a year. And let's talk about the overall backlog. It's estimated that Canada is short 2 million houses right now. So 2 million doors. That doesn't include future immigration. That's today. If they turned off immigration tomorrow and the population stayed the same, Canada needs 2 million houses delivered to get to a neutral market. The most homes Canada ever built in a year was 225,000. We always hover around 200,000. It's not related to how many we can sell. It's not related to how many applications we can put into CMHC. It is a trade limit. There's only so many guys that can swing a hammer or install a pipe or put in construction. And that's why we've naturally always been stuck around 200,000 doors per year. This year, or last year, 2023, it was about 197,000. So that means that even if we shut off immigration tomorrow, other than people dying off, we need 10 years of housing based on the current backlog, right? So I don't see a demand side issue anytime soon, and I don't see a supply side issue by a regime change. The other thing is that this program has been around going back to the 50s or the 60s. Sorry. If you look at all those old apartment buildings in Toronto, a lot of them were built with the versions of it back then. It's obviously evolved and changed over the years with the needs of the country. But once you're locked in, whatever terms you got when you got your approval, those are your terms until 50 years from now, right? So it's not like they can like pull the rug out from under you. Even if they canceled the program the day after your approval, you're good. You're good, right? So it's just, if any changes happened, it would be on future opportunities, not loans that have already been issued. Because think about that. If they just said, no, we're not going to do these 50-year loans anymore, what would happen? There'd be hundreds, if not thousands of buildings all going bankrupt at the same time, which would make absolutely no sense. Anyway, that seems to be it. If there's any other questions, speak now or forever hold your peace, because it's late here and I haven't eaten dinner.
For the people interested, what are the next steps, Jake?
They should reach out to whoever brought them to this meeting and discuss kind of what size of project they might be interested in. I would highly recommend they speak to one of the brokers first to get look, there's some people that know their finances very well. There's other people that don't know their finances very well. And if they don't, they should speak to a broker, determine kind of what kind of buying power they have. And then we can look at what options are currently available and have kind of more private one-on-one discussions about those options.
Sounds good. Thank you. So I'll be reaching out to everyone that I invited. And if anyone else invited you, please reach out to them and we can take it. Okay.
Awesome, guys. And yeah, if you have any other questions, just reach out. I'm always available. I answer the phone. Well, I answer text messages till like 1 a.m. So whenever you have a question, shoot me. Anyway, guys, have a great night. And thank you all very much.
Great job. Thank you so much, Jake.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Have a wonderful evening. Bye now.